I'd lived out on the western edge of Rockridge County for the better part of 2 decades, owning just over 80 acres of rugged, fertile land passed down from my grandfather. It wasn't much to look at from the outside, just a winding dirt drive, a sturdy old gate, and a few weathered barns dotting the pasture. But to me, it was heaven. The land fed my livestock, the hills protected my home, and the quiet, oh, the beautiful silence, was my reward for years of back-breaking work. I wasn't just some city transplant playing cowboy. I was born and raised in this dirt, and my boots had the wear to prove it. The trouble started the moment the new HOA formed at the development just past the county line. They called it Cedar Hills Estates, but the locals knew it better as the Yuppie Corral. Out-of-towners had come in droves, slapping together cookie-cutter houses with big fences, tennis courts, and security cameras pointed every direction but inside. They brought their rules, their bylaws, and worst of all, their attitude. At first, we coexisted like two mismatched neighbors pretending to be polite. They kept to their cul-de-sacs, and I kept to my cattle. But things shifted fast the moment a new president took over the HOA, Karen Delaney. She was a sharp-dressed, sharp-tongued woman who never left her house without a clipboard in one hand and a Bluetooth headset in the other. She claimed she used to run some big corporate office in Chicago, and boy, did she act like it. Within a week of taking the reins, she'd emailed me, called me, and even sent a certified letter to remind me that the gravel road leading to my property crossed Cedar Hills private access lanes. According to her, that meant I had no right to use it without formal approval by the HOA. That road, mind you, had existed since before her subdivision even had plumbing. At first, I ignored her. A woman like that doesn't understand no until you make her hear it twice. I kept driving my truck through the gate like I always had, waved at her security cameras, and went about my day. But Karen wasn't just looking for a fight. She needed one. A week later, I came home from the feed store to find a big metal barrier welded across my ranch gate, right there, with a padlock as thick as my wrist and a bright orange sign that read, "Access denied, private road, violators will be prosecuted." I stared at that sign like it was a rattlesnake coiled in my driveway. I called the county sheriff, an old friend of mine named Walt, and he came out with his deputies. They scratched their heads, made some notes, and shrugged. "The HOA owns the road on paper," Walt muttered. "But you've got historical access. This could turn into a mess if it hits court." I didn't like the sound of that. I didn't want court. I wanted my gate back. Karen showed up an hour later, smug, as a fox in the henhouse. "I warned you," she said, tapping her clipboard. "You've been trespassing on our development road. The board voted unanimously to restrict access. This is private property now. If you need alternative access to your ranch, you'll need to petition the HOA for a usage permit." She said it like she was doing me a favor. I tried to stay calm. "That road has been there longer than your subdivision. My grandfather built it by hand with his old Massey Ferguson. I've used it since I was 10. She smirked. "Then maybe you should have thought ahead and paved your own." That was it. That was the moment the war began. I didn't scream. I didn't argue. I nodded slowly, turned around, and drove back to town. But I didn't go to court. I went to the county records office. You see, the road in question wasn't always under the HOA's thumb. Decades ago, it had been a public easement, one of those old, unimproved rural accesses that got passed around when the land shifted hands. Turns out, years back, a land developer bought up the surrounding parcels and built Cedar Hills, with the promise of private roads and exclusive amenities. But that road still technically had easements tied to neighboring parcels. And wouldn't you know it, a tiny, seemingly useless strip about 12 feet wide and 100 yards long was still in limbo. And it was for sale. I bought it in cash the next day. When Karen and her HOA goons came driving out the next week, they found a brand new sign at the front of the road. "Private road, owner access only, no through traffic. Right underneath was a big steel tractor parked sideways across the lane. And I don't mean a little John Deere. I mean my big rumbling Case IH Quad-Track 620, the kind of machine that looks like it could plow through a house and keep going. Naturally, the HOA flipped. Karen called the sheriff. Again. Walt came out, saw the sign, saw the deed, and shook my hand with a grin. "You're not technically blocking the road," he chuckled. "You're just staging farm equipment on your private land." Karen screeched like a hawk. "He's obstructing access. We need that road." Walt shrugged. "Guess you should have read the fine print." From that point on, I made it my full-time hobby to remind Cedar Hills that this wasn't Chicago. Every day, I parked a different piece of equipment along that. Road, backhoes, hay balers, even an old grain trailer I hadn't used in years. Sometimes I left them running just to let the diesel fumes drift into their freshly manicured lawns. Karen tried everything: cease and desist letters, threats of legal action, even a drone to survey violations. I shot the drone out of the sky with my granddad's shotgun and mounted it over my mailbox like a war trophy. They didn't know who they were messing with. Karen finally offered to buy back the road. She sent me a formal offer, $12,000, and a 1-year usage permit. I mailed the letter back with a single sticky note that said, "Add 6 zeros and we'll talk." The standoff dragged on for weeks. Their residents couldn't get to their tennis courts. Delivery trucks got stuck trying to detour. A school bus had to reverse for half a mile. And through it all, I kept working my land, smiling and waving to the HOA cameras like I was the mayor of my own country. But I wasn't done yet. Because while the HOA tried to fight fire with paperwork, I was digging through property lines like a gold miner on a hot streak. And what I found next would shake their little kingdom down to its concrete foundation. The morning mist hung low over the pasture as I stood sipping coffee from an enamel mug, boots still wet with dew. My dog circled at my feet, anxious for the day to begin, but I was savoring the quiet, one of those mornings that felt like the land was breathing with you. It had been weeks since the incident with the HOA blocking my ranch gate, and in that time, the situation had escalated far beyond what any of them had expected, especially Karen. This next stretch was the wildfire, because while Karen and her HOA minions thought blocking a man's gate was going to make him bow, they didn't consider that some men have more patience than firewood in winter, and I had plenty of both. You see, after I bought the access road and parked my tractors along it, I didn't just sit idle. No, sir. I began digging, figuratively and literally. It started with a trip to the county records office. Most folks think paper trails are boring, but when you own land, especially old land, those records are the storybooks of your property. Tucked in forgotten files, buried beneath layers of legal jargon and outdated surveys, are clues to battles long fought and easements long granted. And I found gold. Turns out, decades ago, before the Cedar Hills HOA even existed, a right-of-way had been granted to the original ranchers for access through multiple parcels of what is now HOA territory. This wasn't just a narrow cattle path. It was a full-fledged easement that wrapped around the development, touching areas the HOA didn't even realize they didn't fully own. When Karen's group bought up land for their neighborhood, they never did their homework on the deeper entanglements attached to the properties. Even better, some of these access points had fallen into disuse but had never been legally vacated. I consulted with an old friend, Joe Carson, a land attorney with a spine made of barbed wire and a memory like a courthouse ledger. Joe took one look at the stack of papers I brought him and whistled low. "Buddy, you don't just have a case. You've got a rope around their necks and you're holding the knot." He wasn't wrong. What I held in my hands was leverage, the kind that could bend cities, and in this case, completely upend an HOA. With that, we began the process of not just asserting my right to access, but expanding it through a series of purchases and leasebacks. I tracked down owners of thin parcels that backed onto HOA green space, many of whom didn't even live in the area anymore. They were more than happy to sell me slivers of neglected land for pennies on the dollar, especially once they heard what I was doing with it. More than one of them had their own beef with the HOA. Over the course of 3 weeks, I acquired 6 key plots and merged them under a private holding entity. That patchwork of land now formed a direct corridor from my ranch to the state highway, a bypass route that would make the old access road obsolete. But the real beauty? The only way the HOA could legally connect its water lines and power grid to their planned Phase 2 development was through land I now owned, and I wasn't about to give up a square inch of it. I remember the moment I signed the final deed. It was a foggy Tuesday morning, and the notary had driven out to the ranch to finalize the paperwork. As I pressed my signature into the paper, I couldn't help but chuckle. Here I was, just a stubborn rancher in a beat-up flannel shirt, playing chess with people who thought they could outmaneuver anyone with a title in front of their name. The letter to the HOA went out the next day. It was formal, legally sound, and brutal in its simplicity. As of this filing, access through your development for the purpose of connecting utilities or transit to adjacent parcels is denied unless a usage lease is agreed upon with the new landowner. Lease pricing begins at $9,500 a month. All prior assumed easements are null under recorded property acquisitions, effective immediately. Karen must have blown a gasket. That much was obvious when 2 days later, a representative from their legal firm showed up unannounced at my ranch gate, looking sheepish and overdressed. He asked for a few minutes of my time. I offered him exactly 5, and we spoke under the porch. He tried his best to sound polite. Tried to explain how what I was doing was unusual, unexpected, and potentially reversible. But his voice cracked when he got to the end, because he could tell I wasn't bluffing. And I wasn't negotiating. I told him plainly, "Your people blocked my gate. I bought the road. Your people tried to box me in. I boxed you out. You want to undo that? You're gonna need a checkbook big enough to buy shame back from the devil himself." The man left, with sweat beading his temples, and I knew the message had landed. But I wasn't done, because the press had caught wind of the story. Some local paper ran a feature about the rancher who outlawed an HOA. That went viral. The next week, I was doing interviews with agriculture blogs, freedom-focused YouTube channels, and even a late-night radio host who called me the John Wayne of land ownership. I didn't care for fame, but the publicity meant one crucial thing: pressure. Pressure on the HOA board from residents who suddenly saw Karen not as a savior of property values, but as the tyrant who dragged their home prices through the mud. Pressure from city officials who were now dealing with a rising number of complaints and development delays. And pressure from Karen herself, who had once strutted through the neighborhood like a queen and now couldn't show her face without whispers chasing her heels. By the time the 3rd month rolled around, Cedar Hills was in chaos. Residents were hosting secret meetings without HOA approval. Someone spray-painted "Free the Road" on the stone pillars by the gate. Rumors spread that Karen had hired a private investigator to dig into my finances, which was funny considering I kept everything cleaner than a pressure-washed barn floor. The final straw came when I filed for agricultural expansion zoning on one of the newly acquired plots. That little stretch of land, now designated as a farm operations access, included permission to run heavy farm equipment down the corridor adjacent to their pristine tennis courts. I had no intention of doing so immediately, but just the approval set their nerves on fire. HOA members began quitting. Their president of legal affairs, some poor guy named Mitchell, resigned after residents bombarded him with threats of litigation. Karen? She went quiet. Deafeningly so. That's when the envelope came. It was hand-delivered, slipped beneath my front door while I was out fencing. The handwriting on the front was neat, almost too formal. Inside was a letter written in elegant, cursive on thick, cream-colored paper. "Mr. Bennett, you've made your point. We acted unfairly. I acted unfairly. I allowed myself to see you as a problem instead of a person. I let pride cloud judgment, and the consequences have been far greater than anticipated. I ask only for peace, for the community, and for my own sanity. Sincerely, Karen L. Winter, former HOA president, former. That word hit like thunder. I sat on the porch, staring at the letter while the cicadas screamed around me and the wind carried the scent of mesquite across the field. It wasn't victory I felt. It was vindication. Because Karen had tried to erase my existence from land my family had held for generations, and now she was the one erased, from power, from position, from pride. A week later, the Cedar Hills HOA voted to dissolve. The decision came after an emergency all-residents meeting that turned into a verbal brawl. Videos surfaced on social media showing people screaming about dues, lawsuits, and that damned rancher. In the end, cooler heads, or maybe just exhausted ones, prevailed. The vote passed 72 to 12. They tore down the gate within days. The A signs came next. Then the fancy-coded keypads. In a matter of weeks, Cedar Hills transformed from a gated utopia into a humbled cluster of homes, just another neighborhood learning to live without a leash. And me? I went back to life as usual. Mornings in the field, evenings by the fire pit. I moved the tractors off the road eventually, now that the point had been made. But I kept the easements, every last one. And just to drive it home, I placed a new, wooden sign at the top of the old blocked access road. Burned into its surface with a branding iron were the words, "This land was here before the paperwork." And beneath that, in smaller script, "Try me again. I'll buy the rest." Because some people think land is just property lines and deeds. But for those of us born to it, raised on it, and who bleed into its soil, that land is legacy. And no HOA, no matter how petty or powerful, gets to rewrite that truth.